Hello, Brubs. We're back with The Devil and the Jews. The medieval conception of the Jew and its relation to modern anti Semitism by Joshua Trachtenberg, a 1943 book. Chapter 2 Antichrist. The most vivid and no doubt impressive statement of this attitude is to be found in the numerous versions of the Antichrist legend, which was universally known and accredited in Christian Europe. According to common belief, Christendom faced an imminent war with the embattled forces of Satan, which would engulf all the world, and at whose successful conclusion Christ would reappear to usher in the millennial era of peace under the banner of his Catholic Church. Not only the masses, but many outstanding thinkers anticipated the speedy coming of Antichrist, the grand marshal of Satan's hosts, and the embodiment of all evil, who, as Hildegard of Bingen, 12th century, voiced the prevailing view, will excel in all diabolical arts and in the magic art. There is evidence in the records of the Spanish Inquisition that the messianic expectations widely held among the harassed Marranos or crypto-Jews during the 15th century were interpreted as relating to the Antichrist. The two themes were intimately associated with Christ by the two themes were intimately associated by church dialecticians. Early in the Christian era, it was pointed out that if Jesus was the Messiah, the only person for whom the Jews could be waiting would be, by their own methods of arguing, also the Antichrist. An 11th century formula of renunciation of Judaism requires the convert to anathematize all those who hope for the coming of the Messiah, or rather of Antichrist. The context links this declaration definitely with the Jewish tradition concerning the Messiah. The Antichrist legend, however, as distinct from the simple belief in the coming of this figure, is of comparatively late origin, a reference in a 10th century source to that nun, sick, who is expected by the Hebrews to give birth to the Antichrist, indicates that it was taking shape by that time. And here is Lucas, is that Cranach? The Antichrist. What am I doing? I'm reading a book. A popular legend illustrates the process of its formulation quite graphically. It relates that after the destruction of Jerusalem, Satan appeared to the Jewish exiles and offered to restore them to their homeland. But when they accepted his offer, he caused them to drown by thousands in the sea. The purport of the legend to present Satan as the expected Jewish Messiah is unmistakable. But this is not legend, only feeble parody of a historic event. Such an incident actually occurred. In the 5th century, a certain messianic pretender, calling himself Moses, appeared in Crete and persuaded the thousands that he would lead them across the sea to Palestine. In this belief, they leaped from the cliffs and many were drowned. Christian legend simply identified the Messiah of this incident more specifically. The legend blossomed forth as a fully developed popular theme only in the later Middle Ages. Leading scholastics such as Thomas Aquinas and Albertus Magnus devoted considerable attention to it, holding in general that Antichrist will be born in Babylon, of the tribe of Dan, will proceed to Jerusalem, where he will be circumcised and will easily persuade the Jews that he is their long-awaited Messiah. Allah, Brahms. He will then rebuild the temple, establish his throne there, and proclaim himself God. By means of miraculous deeds, bribes, and sheer force, he will rapidly accumulate a vast army of adherents, but his power is destined to endure only 3.5 years. God will then send Enoch and Elijah to raise an opposition against him, but he will overcome and slay them. Thereupon Christ will dispatch the archangel Michael to destroy him on the Mount of Olives. The millennium, however, will not necessarily begin immediately thereafter. The popular view tended to follow that of the schoolmen, with the difference, however, as might be expected, that it embellished this general outline of the Antichrist's career with lush detail. Of especial interest to a good many people, it would seem, was his origin, which was expounded in increasingly extravagant terms, only the minority holding that he would be a natural man, legitimately born. For most, he was to be, at the least, a bastard, or the son of a whore, or of an incubus and a whore. The scholastics were willing to permit him a prostitute mother, but when the devil was brought into the picture as his father, they rebelled, though they were prepared to agree that his birth would in some way be influenced by the latter. The tendency to accord the devil and his Jews leading roles in the piece was not, however, to be downed. It was climaxed to the distaste of the more critical by the antithetical parallel between the Antichrist and the Christ, making the first the child of a union between the devil and a Jewish harlot, in deliberate contrast to that other son of God and a Jewish virgin. Though born in Babylon or Persia, this popular parallel proceeded. He would be raised in Galilee and trained by sorcerers and witches in their black art until at the age of 30 he would reveal himself to the Jews in Jerusalem as their Messiah. His apparent triumph, made possible by his assumed personal probity and saintliness, by his vast erudition and persuasive preachments, which unite all preceding heresies, by his miraculous but really magical feats, his great wealth derived from the hidden treasures that the devil discloses to him, and the force and terror unleashed by his armies, is brought to an end after only 3.5 years, the duration of Jesus' ministry, when he tries to ape Jesus' final achievement and ascend to heaven, borne by demons. Michael is dispatched to destroy him. His followers are annihilated after a period variously given as of 25 to 40 days, during which they continue in the delusion of victory. The world comes to an end, and Christ makes his second appearance. This was the biography of the Antichrist as the masses knew him. The relation between the Jews and the Antichrist was particularly assessed or stressed in these accounts of his career. Not alone was his parentage Jewish, on both sides it might be said, but so was his earliest and most effective support. Even the artists who designed the manuscript illuminations and later the woodcuts and engravings and painted the pictures that adorned the churches went out of their way to emphasize this point. When it is a matter of depicting them, the Jews, in an odious role, remarked Ulysses Robert. I'm sure that's botched. Ulysses Robert in a study of the medieval Jew badge, such as the agents of the Antichrist, the executioners of Enoch and Elijah, for example, or the enemies of Christ. Often, or then, the circles are deliberately exaggerated. One must not be left in doubt that these are Jews. Besides the pamphlets and tracts in prose and verse which presented the legend in full and terrifying detail, and the homiletical disquisitions that pounded home its moral, the stage also seized upon the theme and lavished upon it its capacity for incitation. The Latin original of the medieval Antichrist plays Ludus Paschalis de Adventu Interitu Antichristi, 13th century. I'm sure I botched that all. Accords the Jew a somewhat incidental role in that only after the Antichrist has made wide conquests do they accept him as their Redeemer. But the later French and German versions, following the popular disposition, display the Jews as prime movers in the drama. In the French play of Besançon, a Jewish prostitute eagerly offers herself to her satanic paramour in order that she may bear a child who will wield the greatest power among men and through whom Christendom will be destroyed and Jewry raised up again. Yurt chrétienté mort et juif seront relève. I don't know how to say that. The Mauryan version of this drama has a Jewish voluptuary deliver his daughter into Satan's hands for the express purpose of mothering the Antichrist. The child in both plays is reared for the mission by Satan, and when he is finally ready to go forth, he appears first among the Jews, who instantly flock to his standard and acknowledge him as their true Messiah and Redeemer. Throughout this action, an acute contrast is drawn between the Jews' rejection of God's Son and their acclamation of Satan's. With the aid of the Jews, Antichrist conquers the world until, through a series of miracles, God reveals his real character. Antichrist and Jews fall dead, and the millennium is ushered in with great rejoicing, as much over the eternal damnation of the Jews as over the final victory of the Church. The German Lenten play Herzog von Burgund by Hans Fohl's 15th century, also based upon the Antichrist theme, omits the reference to Antichrist's Jewish parentage, but places the eager adherence of the Jews to him in sharp relief by playing up their contemporaneous situation, referring especially to the recent expulsion of Jewish communities along the Rhine and the Danube. The Jews are his protagonists on the stage, extolling before their Christian audience the new order he is about to inaugurate, which will be dominated by their own Judashite, for they exalt as the Antichrist. His mission is to put an end to the Christians. When a sign is demanded to prove Antichrist's right to the Messiahship, the Jews indignantly reject the imputation of fraud and brazenly offer to become prisoners of the Duke of Burgundy, should their champion be shown up as a liar. Antichrist, of course, fails to pass the test, while the Jews wail and curse in comic hyperbole. Finally, the impostor is forced to show his true colors. For 1400 years, he says in response to the Duke's demand that he explain why he proclaimed himself Messiah, we have suffered the gravest injuries from the Christians, and we would have suffered much more did you but know the intense hatred we feel for you. How we have robbed you and our physicians have poisoned you. How many of your children we have stolen and killed, etc. Now the Antichrist himself speaks as a Jew, the long-awaited Messiah come to redeem his people. This false Messiah act, he admits, was a deliberate attempt to confuse and subdue the Christians. If it miscarried this time, it will yet succeed another. But that hope is vain. The Duke's men unceremoniously fall upon the Jews, subject them to extreme and even fantastic tortures, and the drama concludes with a dance of glee around their corpses. The effect of these plays upon the passions of the mob may be gauged from the action of the Frankfurt City Council in 1469, establishing special regulations for the protection of the Jewish quarter during the period when such a play was being presented. To appreciate fully the peculiar impact of the legend, we must set it against the prevailing psychological mood. It may be too easily dismissed as pure fantasy, merely another of the fabulous motifs that entertained the Middle Ages, without exerting any momentous influence upon the thought and action of the common people. But the Antichrist was no legendary dragon spouting imaginary fire. He was a terrifying reality, even in those ages when his appearance was not imminently awaited. What an abysmal shudder of dread rocked all Europe when it came to anticipate his appearance with every rising sun. A religious current of guilt, fear, desperation, and disillusion seems to have overwhelmed the continent in the 15th century. The end of the world was at hand. The witchcraft madness swept into full swing. The Hussites broke away from the church after a fierce struggle, and everywhere heretical views, brazenly voiced, became increasingly prevalent. The Turks overran the Balkan Peninsula and advanced toward the heart of Europe. Mass hysteria of epidemic proportions produced physical as well as psychic manifestations in many communities. These phenomena were seen as nothing less than warnings of the approaching end of days. Even the expansion of scientific knowledge and the invention of movable type at the beginning of the 16th century, the Sorbonne petitioned the king to suppress the diabolical art of printing, and particularly the increasing number of editions of the Bible in the vernacular were singled out with dismay as signs of the time. Die Zit, die Kumt. I don't know what the hell that says. Gloomily chanted Sebastian Brandt. This time is coming. The time is coming. The time is here. I fear the Antichrist is near. One can hardly exaggerate the impression made upon the common people by the Antichrist theme, which both summed up and dramatically expressed all their overbrimming black discontent and foreboding. We can recognize the characteristic hysterical outbreaks as a product of the unbearable tension induced by the fear of Antichrist's arrival, with a good deal more assurance than they distinguished them as a sign of his coming. A favorite homo, homiletical text dinned into their ears by the preachers, constantly presented under churchly auspices and in the tract and creative literature and poetry and drama and art, freely and frequently debated in open disputations, often at the express request of the laity. The Antichrist was no mere creature of scholarly dispute, but the deeply disturbing concern of everyone. Matthias of Janau, who died in 1394 before the public apprehensiveness had attained its greatest intensity, could already write that this theme was so universally and thoroughly discussed that at Antichrist's appearance even the little children would instantly know him. We may well believe the plaint of Hieronymus de Villavitis about a half century later. So much is being said of the day of the last judgment and the Antichrist that our hearts tremble greatly. In the last years of the Middle Ages, no less a person than John Calvin testified. Among the Catholics, nothing is more discussed or well known than the anticipated coming of the Antichrist. He was in error if he meant to imply that the Reformers were innocent of this superstition. Martin Luther, for one, played the universally popular game of checking off the signs of his advent. True, the Antichrist legend bore assurance that the adversary would ultimately be defeated. Why despair? But his coming meant the end of the world and the last judgment. Who could anticipate this event with anything but fear and trembling? And suppose the legend was wrong, the devil was a mighty antagonist. His full strength was as yet untested. Suppose in the end he did win. The Jews once again played a sinister role in world history. Their association with this awful figure, as we have noted, goes back to the earliest Christian period, but it assumed really frightening proportions only toward the end of the Middle Ages, when Antichrist's Jewish parentage became definitely established, and the Jews were expected to form the spearhead of his legions. They were not quite so weak in the medieval imagination, aside from their satanic backing, as we may suppose, judging alone from their numbers and social position. For a terrible, mysterious Jewish horde hidden somewhere in the east awaited the signal to pour out upon Christendom and annihilate it. The rumors of the birth of Antichrist, which became increasingly frequent and circumstantial after the 13th century, kept Europe on edge, awaiting the bloody outbreak of the Red Jews from their secret mountain retreat in the vicinity of the Caspian Sea, where, according to legend, Alexander the Great had long ago confined them. This is one of the most curious features of the entire Antichrist complex, for it harked back to the old Jewish tradition that the lost 10 tribes of Israel still maintained an independent and glorious existence somewhere in the Orient, and would one day rejoin their brethren at a critical moment. Indeed, the belief that the Antichrist would be born to the tribe of Dan in Babylon or Persia was of a piece with this notion, for Dan was one of the lost tribes which were supposedly in this region. When news of the Mongol incursion in the 13th century reached Western Europe, a number of reports assure us the Jews were overjoyed at the prospect that their brothers, the long shut up tribes of Israel, were at last moving to deliver them. The Jews of Germany, in particular, were accused of undertaking traitorous measures to aid the invading hordes and suffered severe persecutions. Such rumors kept cropping up from time to time, and as late as 1596, several true news reports, in quotations, were published in pamphlet form recounting that these Red Jews, constituting an army ranging from 196,000 to 900,000 men, according to different statements, with the Virgin at their head, had already begun an attack upon the Turks to regain the Holy Land. Moreover, another ominous figure made his appearance on the European scene at about this time. The wandering Jew, reports of whose existence in the Orient had reached England some 3 centuries before, but of whom little new had been reported since, suddenly undertook a personal tour of Europe in the 16th century, visiting with startling rapidity all its foremost cities. The significance of this apparition, now known by the name of Ahasuerus, lay in the fact that he was to die at last when Christ returned to earth. These reports must be considered in conjunction with the recurrent rumors of the birth of Antichrist if we are to appreciate fully their effect upon the masses. In 1599, while stories of the eruption of the Red Jews were still circulating widely, according to Canon Moreau, a contemporary historian, a rumor spread with prodigious rapidity through Europe that Antichrist had been born at Babylon, and that already the Jews of that part were hurrying to receive and recognize him as their Messiah. One can understand that the advent of every pretended Jewish Messiah was heralded among Christians in this fashion, though the announcement of the birth of Antichrist is an obvious reflection of the parallelism between the Christ and the Antichrist myths, and whom there were not a few, of whom there were not a few in this period. The very next year, oh man, we are provided with conclusive proof that the legend operated without benefit of the Jewish messianic expectation and had, in fact, no relation to it. The announcement was broadcast that Antichrist had been born that year in the neighborhood of Paris of a Jewess named Blanche Fleur, who had conceived by Satan. A witch, under torture, acknowledged that she had rocked the infant Antichrist on her knees, and she testified that he had claws on his feet, wore no shoes, and spoke all languages. Medieval Christendom was in no position to assay such rumors critically, since the constant repetition of the legend with the ascent and indeed under the auspices of the church had prepared it for just such an eventuality, which it believed foredoomed. Satan and the Jews must one day descend upon the Christian world in a final mad effort to destroy it. The theologians held that there were two realms on earth, the kingdom of Christ and the kingdom of the devil. All men belonged to one or the other. This belief was not simply a pious thought, nor merely a symbolic figure for good and evil, but stark reality for the common people as surely as for the schoolmen. And writing on the Jewish question, a member of the Pope's household reminded Duke Henry of Bavaria in 1449. Wernet and Gott gelobt der ist des Teufels. Whoever does not believe in the Christian God belongs to the devil. Thus, the common phrase, their, the Jews, father, the devil, their father, the devil, all right, was no mere aspersion, but a statement of bare fact so far as Christian belief was concerned. The noted Spanish theologian Alfonso de Spina went so far as to prove from Jewish sources in a chapter of his famous Fortalitium Fidei, devoted to the parentage of the Jews according to the doctrine of the Talmud, that the Jews are the children of the devil. Quite plausibly, Christians who were seduced into joining the synagogues of Satan entered it at the instigation of the devil, and there found themselves in company with the devil's offspring, invoking demons and giving to them the honor that is due to God. Does the devil supposedly have any children? When Christians suffered, they did so to the great joy of the devil and the Jews. When Jews remained steadfast in their faith and refused to submit to the blandishments or threats of their would-be Christian saviors, preferring to let themselves be burned alive rather than yield the needlepoint of their belief, the source of their obstinacy was easily discernible. They were damned devil's martyrs. Small wonder, then, that in view of this attitude, the conscience of Christendom was little burdened by the unexampled persecution to which the Jews were subject. They had it coming to them. The average Christian could contend, for Christian treatment of the Jew was mild compared to what they would suffer were the world in Jewish hands. The children of God that we are, poisonous worms that you are, if we were by you controlled, as you in our power are enrolled, no Christian would survive the year, wrote a medieval rhymester, a sentiment strongly echoed by Luther. And Abraham, a Santa Clara, writing in the 17th century, could say of the Jews, those mad fiends, as he called them. After Satan, Christians have no greater enemies than the Jews. They pray many times each day that God may destroy us through pestilence, famine, and war, that all beings and creatures may rise up with them against the Christians. Can greater scoundrels than these Jews be found anywhere in the whole world? Little wonder, too, that Jews were accused of the foulest crimes, since Satan was their instigator. Chaucer, in his Priors's tale, placed the ultimate blame for the alleged slaughter of a Christian child by a Jew upon our first foe, the serpent Sathanus, that hath in, I don't know what the hell this is, Jews hurt his wasp nest. Gregory of Tours took pains to note that when a certain Jew vented his displeasure upon another who had permitted himself to be baptized by dumping a pot of rancid oil on his head, Satan was behind the deed. But such tautologies were hardly required. Everyone knew that the devil and the Jews worked together. This explains why it was so easy to condemn the Jews a priori for every conceivable misdeed, even if it made no sense. They were just as likely to invade a church and desecrate its sacred images in the presence of a large and hostile audience, to deride sacred Christian beliefs publicity to shower abuse and filth on religious processions, or refuse to acknowledge the veracity of miracles which trustworthy Christian witnesses had observed, thus deliberately, madly, if they might be judged by purely human standards, inviting disaster as to murder Christian infants in secret, despoil the host, spread poison with the wind, practice infamous sexual immoralities. The catalogue of alleged Jewish crimes is long and varied indeed, and wholly unreasonable, unless we accept the self-evident fact in medieval eyes that as Satan's agents, nothing was beyond the depraved and evil nature of the Jews. And we got to read this chapter too. How long does this go? 53 pages? 9 more pages. What are we at? 31 minutes? And this is The Devil and the Jews, the medieval conception of the Jew and its relation to modern anti-Semitism. I guess I might as well keep reading. Oh, we lost our page. How sad. I believe this is the end of the first part after this trip. Chapter 3, With Horns and Tails. The story is not yet complete. The Jew was also believed to possess certain physical characteristics which definitely set him apart from other men and identified him with the devil. Corroborative evidence that points up the literalness of this conception in the medieval mind. The figure of the horned Jew was not uncommon during the Middle Ages. We know it best through Michelangelo's magnificent Moses, which reproduced the traditional feature of the lawgiver's countenance on display in many a medieval church and manuscript. The customary explanation of those curious horns protruding from Moses' brow is that they are the products of a misinterpretation of Exodus 34:29, 35, and behold, the skin of his face sent forth beams. The old translations render the Hebrew root Karan or Karan correctly as shine. Aquila and the Vulgate, the standard text followed by the church, read, however, his face had horns. This misunderstanding may have been favored by the Babylonian and Egyptian conception of horned deities. Sin, Ammon, by the Greek use of horns as symbolic of might, e.g., the horned figures of Jupiter, and by the legend of the two-horned Alexander the Great, referred to in the Quran, Surah. I'm not going to read the numbers. I guess it doesn't matter. It is quite likely that this misinterpretation was at the bottom of Michelangelo's conception of the two-horned Moses. But when we find ordinary Jews, medieval Jews in typical medieval garb, crowned with horns, we may reasonably suspect that something more lies behind this than a faulty translation. Indeed, the matter of horns went considerably further than pictorial representation. Jews were actually obliged to appear in public with the distinguishing horn somewhere on their garb. And let's look at these before I continue. Youth, virgin, Jew, and soldier. Not sure what this is depicting, but wood carving on choir stool in the church of Notre Dame, Arschot, Belgium, 15th century. What's he doing? What is that thing? Jews were actually obliged to appear in public, blah, blah. In 1267, the Vienna Council decreed that Jews must wear a horned hat, Pilium cornutum, a provision which later councils sought strenuously to enforce, and Philip III required the Jews of France to attach a horn-shaped figure to the customary Jew badge. Talk of the devil and his horns appears, says the proverb, in an age so familiar with Satan's least feature as the medieval. The portrayer of the horned Jew need not have felt called upon to make his allusion more specific, yet an occasional hyper literalist, not content with sketching the horned Jew alone, scratches the devil alongside him. For good measure, and in one instance at least, that horned Jew is identified with the legend in boldface. This is the Jew devil. Nor were his horns the Jew's sole physical token of his Satanism. The devil's tail is as characteristic as his horns, and consequently only the least stretch of the imagination was required to perceive the Jew's diabolic dorsal appendage, even though he managed cunningly to hide it from common view. And in the event, we find it difficult to believe that these notions were accepted in all seriousness. It must be pointed out that such beliefs are still prevalent not only among benighted European peasantries, but even in our own enlightened land. A supposedly characteristic feature of the Jewish physiognomy, which is constantly stressed in the prints and particularly in the folk tales, is the so-called Ziegenbart, goat's beard or goatee. This otherwise obscure detail assumes meaning when we consider it in conjunction with the common representation of the Jew in association with the he-goat, either as his favorite domestic animal or as his favorite mount, which he prefers to ride facing backward. To judge from the prince, or the goat is offered as the symbol of Judaism and the Jewish God. When Ike came a riding on a billy goat, he had the Jews believing it was their precious God. Runs a widely current bit of doggerel whose origin is placed in the late Middle Ages. Evidently, the intent is to single out the goat as the Jews' beast, or perhaps the Ziegenbart emphasis is intended to identify the Jew as the human goat. Indeed, a carved relief of Judensau with her Jewish brood, once to be seen on the tower of a bridge in Frankfurt, included the figure of a Jew with two unmistakable goat's horns on his head. To make certain that the origin of those horns was not missed, the artist cut a billy goat with identical horns into the stone, interestedly watching the proceedings. The Bach, or billy goat, as the Middle Ages knew full well, is the devil's favorite animal, frequently represented as symbolic of satanic lechery. According to popular legend, the devil created the goat, which appears in picture and story as the riding animal of every conceivable sort of hobgoblin, as well as of witches and sorcerers. In the witch craze that swept Europe toward the end of the Middle Ages, the devil's most usual disguise was said to be that of a goat, which the devotees worshipped and adored, and it was the animal most commonly offered to him as a sacrifice. So close was the relation between them that an early 15th century illustration picturing four Jews being led by him represents Satan himself as having goat's horns. The purport of this association of Jew and goat is quite unmistakable. A 15th century sculptured figure in a Flemish church shows a Jew astride a goat. Facing its rear, the animal's hinds hoofs are cloven, and its forefeet end in claws. The ascription to the Jew of a distinctive and unpleasant odor has often been commented upon. Many peoples, of course, have at various times had this libel leveled against them, not only in popular belief, but even in pseudoscientific works. We may interpret it as an effort by one group to stigmatize another socially inferior group as being physically inferior as well, a sort of extra prop to bolster up the former's sense of superiority. It is probable that when an offensive odor was charged against the Jews by ancient writers such as Martial and Ammianus Marcellinus, it was more as an expression of contempt for the barbarians than with any more subtle intent. But the notion of the so called Judaicus so prevalent in the Middle Ages, though undoubtedly reflecting something of the same motivation, and perhaps at the onset, little more than an echo of the classical charge, carried a deeper meaning to the medieval Christian. There was never a state so large and that a mere 30 Jews would not saturate it with stench and unbelief, declaimed the 13th century Austrian poet Siegfried Helbling. Stench and unbelief were characteristic Jewish attributes in combination. The measured sobriety of legal prose buckled under the necessity of legislating for Jews. In 1421, the city of Aachen, Buddha ordered the Jews, the mean, stiff-necked, stinking betrayers of God, to anticlimactically pay a tax on their wine. The combination holds, and its meaning is clearly indicated when we read that the Jew emits a foul odor as punishment for his crime against Jesus. Yet this is only a partial explanation. Why a foul odor as punishment? The answer is apparent when we consider that according to common Christian belief during the Middle Ages, good spirits emit a marked fragrance, while evil spirits, and in particular, of course, Satan, are distinguished by an offensive stench. Myrrh gushes forth like fountains from the grave of the martyrs, we are told, and when the coffin of the martyred Saint Stephen was opened, his body filled the air with fragrance, the odor of sanctity indeed. On the other hand, when the devil is caught masquerading as an astrologer, he vanishes in a whirlwind with a stench, cum turbine et fetor recedens disparuit, brimstone and sulfur. The Fetor Judaicus, then in another distinctive sign of the demonic Jew. Nowhere is this special significance of the Jewish odor specifically stated, except perhaps in the comment that Jews stink like the he-goat, but it is certainly implied in the frequently expressed belief that the Jew loses his odor after he is baptized. We have direct testimony that the water of baptism carried off the Jew's odor, leaving that's convenient, leaving them with a fragrance sweeter than that of ambrosia floating upon the heads touched by the sanctified oil. A number of popular legends illustrate this conviction. According to one, when a Jew approached his daughter who had just been baptized, she suddenly became aware of an exceedingly foul stench emanating from him, which she had formerly, as a Jewess, not noticed. Another legend relates that when a recently baptized Jewish boy came home one day emitting a very pleasant odor, his parents imagined that he stank. Still another legend brings the point home beyond any doubt. To undo the effect of baptism, a Jewish mother proposes to immerse her erring daughter 3 times in the waters of a sewer, but is, of course, frustrated by outraged Christians. The point of this legend is that it reproduces another popular fable, according to which, when the devil accidentally fell into some consecrated water, his grandmother freed him from its effects by dipping him 3 times into the sewer of hell. It should be observed that more recently some writers have omitted a pinch of skepticism into their discussion of the Pater Judaicus. Tovey records that the author of Roma Sancta takes notice, upon such an occasion, baptism, that whereas Jews naturally stink, they constantly lose that ill savor after baptism. But mission voyage into Italy accounts for the miracle by answering that before such sort of people intend to appear in public, they take care to wash themselves well, and that their ill smell before baptism, which prejudiced men think natural, arises from the sordidness of their habits, occasioned by poverty. Bravo for mission, The age of reason has dawned, but how faintly it glimmers still. If it has been somewhat difficult for the Pater Judaicus to stand up in recent times, though not among the Nazi theoreticians, who have now proclaimed it as a profound scientifically verified fact that the faint, sweet racial odor of the Jews is one of their distinctive physical characteristics. It is still prominent in folk literature in a refined version, namely, that the Jews are guilty en masse of the egregious sin of garlic eating. This is modern anti Semitism as distinguished from the medieval variety. The medieval idea is but another instance of the conviction that the church was engaged in a holy war against the forces of Satan. The Jew could shed his demonic attributes only by sloughing off his former demonic self and being reborn through Christ. Such is the moral of these legends, yet, as we shall see, Christians came to doubt whether even baptism could effect a real change in the Jew. Not even his peculiar odor remained permanently effaced. To judge from the plaint heard in 15th century Spain, the conversos smell bad. Whether this was the result of backsliding or of culinary habit remains an open question, even after the statement of the contemporary chronicler Andreas Bernaldus. They never lose their Jewish taste in eating stews of onion and garlic and fried in oil, and the meat cooked in oil. To avoid lard and oil with meat is a thing which gives an ill smell to the breath. And they themselves had the same smell as the Jews, owing to their stews, and to their not being baptized. In still another way did the Middle Ages proclaim its belief that the Jew was not quite human. All men are subject to disease, the Jews among them, but the Jews suffered also from certain peculiar and secret afflictions that were especially characteristic of him, and which did not normally trouble Christians. Indeed, it was this belief that helped to account for the Jewish need of Christian blood, the sole effective therapeutic available to them. Most often mentioned among these ailments was that of menstruation, which the men as well as the women among the Jews were supposed to experience. Close seconds in point of frequency of mention were copious hemorrhages and hemorrhoids, all involving loss of blood. Among the great variety of these maladies were included quinsy, scrofula, a marked pallor, various mysterious skin diseases, and sores that gave forth a malodorous flux. Here we have another explanation of the Fetor Judaicus. A number of late medieval sources affirm also that Jewish children are born with their right hands, blood-stained, resting on their foreheads, as though they were attached to the skin, so that it requires something of an operation to release them. And quite recently, the belief was expressed that the Jews are always born blind, kind of like cats. These infirmities were generally believed to afflict all Jews, though they usually managed to conceal them or to heal them by magical means or through the use of Christian blood. For the accepted explanation of these ailments connected them with the persecution and murder of Jesus. What more natural than that the devil's brood, having brought about the death of the Savior of men, should forever after bear the signs of their iniquity? Indeed, in the 17th century, that late, there began an exercise in tabulating and classifying these fancied ailments according to the 12 tribes of Israel, despite the fact that 10 tribes had disappeared long before the crucifixion and tribal distinctions had long since vanished among Jews, and the alleged crimes of these tribes against Jesus. Thus, in 1602, the converted Jew Franciscus of Piacenza published the following catalog of secret ailments and disabilities, which reappeared presently or subsequently in several versions and languages. The members of the tribe of Reuben who seized and beat Jesus in the garden caused all vegetation which they touched to wither within 3 days. During 4 days annually, bloody wounds appear on the hands and feet of descendants of the tribe of Simeon, because their ancestors struck Jesus while he hung on the cross. Levi struck Jesus in the face and spat on him. Therefore, the members of this tribe have difficulty in spitting and cannot bring up phlegm, because Zebulon threw lots for Jesus' cloak. Annually, on March 25th, they suffer from open wounds in the mouth and spit blood. The tribe of Issachar, who bound Jesus to the post and whipped him, break out with bloody wheels. I don't know how to say that word, wheels, and incurable wounds all over the body on the same day. Dan it was that cried out, let his blood be on us and our children. And therefore every month bloody sores open on their bodies, and they stink so badly they must hide. Only smearing themselves with Christian blood can remedy this. Gad wove the crown of thorns from 15 branches and pressed it on Jesus' head until it penetrated the flesh. Therefore, annually 15 painful bleeding bruises appear on their heads and necks. Asher slapped Jesus in the face, and so their right arms are a hand's breadth shorter than their left. Naphtali, according to this imaginative account, hid their children in pig pens with instructions to grunt and squeal when Jesus passed by. And when they asked him what these were, and he replied, "They are your children," they denied it, insisting these were pigs, whereupon Jesus said, "If they are swine, then swine let them be, and swine let them remain." And thus the tribe of Naphtali have 4 large pig teeth, pig's ears, and stink like swine. Joseph, there was no such tribe, who forged the nails for the crucifixion and dulled their points on the advice of a Jewess named Ventria in order to increase Jesus' suffering, was punished in that the women of this tribe, after their 33rd year, have live worms in their mouths while they sleep. And finally, the tribe of Benjamin, who offered Jesus a sponge saturated with vinegar and gall, cannot raise their heads, always suffer from thirst, and when they try to speak, live worms jump from their mouths. It can readily be seen, then, that Johann Fischart's illustrated Wunderzeitung of the year 1575, announcing the birth to a Jewish woman of Binswangen near Augsburg of 2 little pigs, need not have unduly strained Christian credulity. Nothing was too monstrous to be told about the Jews. The demon Kolbith claims Moss Moke and Avagay, agents of Isaac in Norwich, for the devil. Tallage Roll, 1233. Johann Fischart's Wunderzeitung, announcing the birth of 2 pigs to a Jewish woman. Cute little pigs. And that's the end of part 1 and chapter 3. The devil and the Jews.